Welcome to Interviews from Quito. My name is Andy Sebastia. Our today's guest is Gabriela Aleman. She's an Ecuadorian writer and a scholar. She has a PhD in literature from Tulane University and has published a number of books, both short stories and novels, and she was a successful athlete in basketball. So we're going to have a fantastic interview with Gabriela. Welcome, Gabriela.
Hello, Andy. Thanks for the invitation.
Oh, it was wonderful. We were delighted you're here. And
thank you.
especially some of your busy time to talk about your life, your books, your literature, your writer, and your life as an athlete. Gabriela, when did you realize you wanted to be a writer?
Well, mostly I've considered myself, and until this day, is a reader. But as you were saying before, I used to play professional basketball. And when I was living in Paraguay, where I played in Club Olimpia, I had a knee accident. And I used to take up 5 hours of my day practicing basketball and just involved in the sport. And all of a sudden I found myself with all this time on my hands, and I started writing. That was the first place I published something. And from then on, I haven't stopped, mostly.
So basketball and being a writer, does affect you in your career as being an athlete? Has helped you in some way?
Well, now that I've been writing a little about sports, because usually something that doesn't go together in the same sentence is a woman, writer, and sports.
Yes.
So, and usually when Latin American writers write about sports, usually they write about soccer. And basketball isn't a theme that's out there, or any other sort of sports besides soccer. So I've been writing these past few years a lot, mostly nonfiction, about the time that I was a basketball player, that I was involved in professional sports, and what that involves in day-to-day, right? Practicing, persistence, all of that helps. Having to be in a room for 6-7 hours, just concentrating on something and working with it and practicing with it and editing to finally put it out there, right? So I guess, yeah.
But you were born in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, but you grew up in Paraguay.
Well, no, I've lived in a number of places. I was born in Brazil, and then we moved back to Ecuador. This was all because of my father's work. And after that, we lived in the Dominican Republic. We lived in Mexico. We lived in New York when I was small. I was in PBS and PS 175 in Queens. Then we moved back to Ecuador. Then we went to Switzerland. And then after that, I was studying here, and there was a championship, a South American championship, and the Paraguayan team saw me, and they asked me to come down to Paraguay to play. And I lived in Paraguay for 3 years. And after that, I went to live by myself in Spain. And after that, I went to live in New Orleans, and then I came back here.
Well, you have traveled extensively, more than many people, more than me, I guess. One of the great things about your work as a writer, you write both short stories and novels. Where do you feel you're more comfortable?
But it depends on the topic I'm working on. The first 2 books were, no, the first 3 books were short stories. And mostly the first 2 books were more than about places and stories. They had to do with literature itself. So I was in a sort of dialogue with writers from the past. And those first 2 books were collections of fantastic short stories. Borges, Silvino Campo, to think of it. And also some connection with Gothic tales. So I did some versions of Frankenstein. I did some versions of Dracula. Mostly when I was growing up, that was the sort of literature I liked. So I guess the first few books was taking all that, what I liked in literature, and putting it out there. And then mostly the last few books have gotten more grounded in Latin America, Ecuador, Paraguay, and have to do more with realism than with fantastic literature.
How do you give shape to your characters?
Well, it depends. My first novel was called Body Time. The title was in English, although the story was in Spanish, and that whole novel had to do with the connection between Latin America and New Orleans, because in the 19th century there was a tremendous amount of flow between culture, of commerce, because the port of New Orleans was the center of what was going on in the U.S. before it went up to the East Coast. And Sarah Bernhardt went to Mexico City and then went to New Orleans. And there were all sorts of connections also with Carondelet. The palace, the presidential palace in Ecuador is called Palacio de Carondelet. And Carondelet was the last governor of Spain in New Orleans. So when I made all these connections between New Orleans, which seems so far away from Ecuador in some senses, and I started finding all these connections with Central America, with Ecuador directly, I just felt the need to write this story. And I was studying a PhD at the time at Tulane, so the main characters have to do with the academic world. And then I created a detective novel, sort of noir, and that developed out of that. It had something to do with my connection with history, with Ecuador, with what I had studied in the past, because at some point I studied history, I studied journalism, I studied philosophy. So at some point all of that always converges into what I'm writing.
And many of your characters are inspired on the people you know, or most of them are fiction, or you take a bit of stories of each people and you make up to a story, or how's your mind work as a writer when you're sitting across from the typewriter or the computer now these days?
Well, the first 3 books I wrote on a notebook, and then from then on I've been writing on a laptop. And it does change. It changes how you write, how you pause, how the sentences come out, how the diction works, how the syntax works. I guess going back to what I said before, it depends on each project. The second novel I wrote was called Pozo Wells. And pozo in Spanish means well. And what I did with that book is I went back to one of my dearest and more close to my heart writers, which is H.G. Wells. And H.G. Wells has a strange connection to Ecuador. He wrote this beautiful novella called In the Country of the Blind around 1919, and he set it in Ecuador. Well, and he had never been to Ecuador. And it's the story of a mountain climber who falls into a valley and discovers this town which is populated by blind people. And I had read that when I was 14 years old, and it really reverberated in my mind that someone as famous, as well known, some say the father of science fiction, had set one of his best books in Ecuador without having ever come here. So maybe like 10 years ago, I found this book when I was moving houses, and I reread it, and I said, I have to do something with this. And Pozo Wells came out of that story by H.G. Wells. And then I've just recently published a new book, which is called La Muerte Silvan Blues. And it's a collection of short stories, which also works as a novel. And that story has to do also with H.G. Wells, because in 1949, a man who worked in the radio reproduced what Orson Welles had done in 1938 in Halloween in the radio, when he did a radio recreation of the War of the Worlds. I see. And the Martians landed in New York, and this Leonardo Paez did the same thing, exactly the same thing in Ecuador 11 years after, but with the immense difference that here there were 7 dead. Because the people, when they realized that the Martians hadn't landed and that it was just a fiction, they went to the radio station and they burned it. And the people who were working inside the station, some managed to get out and some were trapped inside. So my last collection it revolves around that episode in Ecuadorian history, and it has to do with journalism, with the power of mass media, with the radio, with H.G. Wells again. And then there's a third connection with H.G. Wells, which is interesting in Ecuador, is the island of Dr. Moreau is set in Galapagos, if you follow the directions that are set in the book. And that was at the point when all the theories of Darwin were being discussed in the world. So there's this, I find, very interesting connection between science fiction, H.G. Wells, and Ecuador. And I think at some point I'm going to go into Dr. Monroe and talk about the Galapagos through fiction. But for the moment, I've touched upon these 2 first connections, the War of the Worlds and In the Country of the Blind.
Gabriela, do you follow any rituals when you write?
Well, I was, I don't know if to say that it's a bad ritual, but something that happened in New Orleans. At some point, I discovered bourbon in New Orleans, and the smell of bourbon with tobacco. And I discovered that all the tobaccos in New Orleans are wrapped, the last leaf is Ecuadorian. And also the Cuban cigars, the last leaf is Ecuadorian because it's, I think it has more humidity, it's more supple. And at some point someone told me in the street in New Orleans that it was wrapped up with Ecuadorian cigars, so I bought it. And that day I was writing some short story, and the connection between the smell, the sweet smell of bourbon with a cigar, it just puts me somewhere else. And I write, like for the past 10 years, I need to smell those two things to be able to work. Maybe then I don't drink it or I don't smoke it, but it has to be in my table.
So you
I guess it's a ritual.
So you actually don't have to puff it, but basically you have to let it just put it on your desk.
Sometimes I do, because the taste is great.
Body Time is your first novel. Takes place in New Orleans. Tell us about the relationship with this city.
Well, like I was telling you before, I discovered all these connections which, before getting to New Orleans, I never imagined. There's a very strong population of people from Haiti and Central America, because when there was the Haitian Revolution, the slaves which escaped from Haiti at some point went to Cuba, and then from Cuba they went to New Orleans. So there's a large population of people who understand Spanish, or their last names are in Spanish, that still, the descendants are still in New Orleans. And then there was a really strong connection at the beginning of the 20th century with workers who went from mostly Honduras and El Salvador to work with tobacco in New Orleans. And then going way back, there's that connection with Carondelet, which ties up Ecuador directly with New Orleans. And then, I mean, one of my favorite writers is Mark Twain, and I had to go see the Mississippi. And then another great writer, Barry Gifford, and he set a lot of stories in New Orleans. So there was all this connection between literature, Truman Capote, the streetcar named Desire. There's some buses that the routes are still called Desire. So there was a strong connection between literature, between Latin America and New Orleans. And then you feel like it's Esmeraldas in New Orleans. I mean, you feel like you're in Ecuador at some point, or you feel like you're in South America. You feel in the Caribbean at some point.
I sense, and I saw some of your work on the internet, and the work of Nela Martinez, Ecuadorian writer and political activist, and some of for the American audience. Who was Nela Martinez, and why it's important to revisit her work?
Well, what I did with it isn't a novel or a collection of short stories, but rather Nela Martinez was the first communist senator in Ecuador. And she married one of the most important political figures of the early 20th century in Ecuador, which was Joaquín Gallegos Lara. Until today, one of the most important movements in Ecuadorian literature is social realism. And Joaquín Gallegos Lara, when he was 29 years old, or rather in the 30s, he published a collection of short stories with 5 other writers from Guayaquil, which was called Los que se van. And that completely changed Ecuadorian literature. It started giving voices to people who worked in the fields, to workers. And at some point, Nela Martinez met Joaquín Gallegos Lara, and they had a romance through letters during 4 years. Then they were married, and then Nela Martinez came to live in Quito. He was living in Guayaquil, and their correspondence lasted 8 years. And Nela Martinez's daughter had all these letters. And she's been working with a number of institutions for the past 10 years, typing them out, making them accessible to scholars. And what happened 2 years ago is that she gave me the 800 letters they had written, and she asked me to write a study about these letters and about these 2 important figures in Ecuadorian culture. And I was working during 2 years reading these marvelous love letters, but also letters that had to do with the political moment at the time, which spoke of all the divisions in Ecuador at the time, and which were just, they're incredibly rich for any scholar who wants to study anthropology, history, culture, art. And so I've been working closely with those two figures and what was going on in the 30s in Ecuador, which has influenced so much of what happened afterwards in Latin American, in Ecuadorian literature and Latin America, because at that moment, Ecuador wasn't isolated from what was going on in other countries. Jorge Amado was writing about the cacaoteros and the caucheros in Brazil. Arguedas was writing in Peru. Mariátegui was very important at the time. So Nela Martínez and Joaquín Gallegos Laras put us in the map of what was going on in Latin American culture in the 1930s, 40s.
A few years ago, you were recognized as one of the most important young writers in Latin America. Can you tell us about that, and tell us about the Guggenheim Award in 2006? That it was very happy to see that. Yeah,
it was great because I was able to, actually after I got the Guggenheim, I was able to write Pozo Wells and concentrate on other projects which didn't have to do so much with university, which was mostly how I make a living is teaching. But because of the Guggenheim, because of what happened, the Hay Festival, which is this important literature festival which takes place in Wales every year, started branching out, and now they have a Hay Festival in Cartagena and they have a Hay Festival in Segovia. And what they've been doing is that since year 2000, every year there's a different city that becomes the capital of the world in terms of letters. And in 2007, Bogotá was the capital of letters. I don't know how you say it in English. It was la capital de las letras. And Hay Festival decided, because Bogotá was recognized as this capital, to do something, because also it coincided with the 40 years of publication of 100 Years of Solitude. And there was a lot of discussion that the boom of Latin American letters had been a creation of the critics, that Vargas Llosa and Garcia Marquez and all of the writers who came out of the boom, Carlos Fuentes, not to say that they weren't great writers, but that they were a creation of the critics at the time. And the Hay Festival decided that it was a good idea 40 years after to search for 39 writers under 39 and see what was going on in terms of literature in Latin America. And I was lucky enough to be recognized in that group, and since then, because of that, I've been able to not only publish in Ecuador, but be in collections of short stories, have more translations out there, and I've published 2 collections of books or short stories after Bogotá 39, and I've had translations into English, into French, into Chinese, so it was a great experience.
Fantastic experience for a writer like you, that for Ecuador. I found your second novel very interesting. Pozo Wells is a political satire. What is it all about? This is a second novel you're doing.
Well, like I was telling you, I started out making the connection between the country of the blind, and then I set it in a contemporary Ecuador, and I just wanted to have some fun with all the politics that goes on in Latin America. And it starts out with a politician who's campaigning, and he gets electrocuted with his own urine. So I thought it would be poetic. It was poetic justice. So I had fun with the book. It's a book that apart from being very dark humor, I was touching a lot of what I thought was going to be the main points of what's coming in Latin America as centers of debate, which is the exploitation of minerals. It was the point where copper was discovered in the valley of Intag, and there's been a number of multinationals trying to get into that copper, and it's just going to destroy the ecosystem. So in that book I talk about those wars that are coming because of water, because of minerals, all the corruption in politics in not only in Ecuador, but in general in Latin America.
Also, I found your latest collection of short stories, the album La Familia, is known to stories of Ecuador. How do you go about doing those short stories?
Well, what happened is I was lucky enough. Well, all of the stories at some point connect with something that actually happened in the history of Ecuador. And two of those short stories are set in Galapagos. And I was lucky enough that I was teaching in Galapagos because Universidad San Francisco de Quito, where I teach, has a station there where mostly they teach biology, but I was teaching a class in literature. So I lived for 3 months in Galapagos, and when I was there, I mean, you swim, you walk, but there's not much to do, so I did a lot of reading in the library. And I found out that one of those famous book that everybody has read is Robinson Crusoe. And Robinson Crusoe is based on a real pirate from Scotland who was called Selkirk. And Selkirk, after being rescued from La Isla de Pascua, this is the true story, he was taken back in another pirate ship to Guayaquil. And he actually was one of the pirates that ransacked Guayaquil. And then they went to Galapagos to hand out the treasure that they had won in Guayaquil. So I thought this was great. There weren't too many people who knew this story. So I started from this, and I created a story that had to do with the present day of an old man who's dying, who goes to the Galapagos to die. But this story about Selkirk and Guayaquil and the pirates comes up at some point. Then the second story, which is another story that isn't too well known, is that in the 1930s, a little before the Second World War, when the world politics was already shifting towards democracy versus fascism, at some point, the Galapagos Islands were very important in terms of its strategic position in the map. And they were the entrance to the Panama Canal. So during those years, the 30s, there were a lot of German submarines and Japanese submarines that were in the waters of Galapagos. And there were a number of spies who were there. And there was a woman who came in those years called La Baronesa. And La Baronesa, some say, apparently was a spy for the Japanese. And there was a strange thing that happened in La Isla Floriana. All of this is true, that there was a family of 2 German families who were living there at the time. And after the Baronesa got there, almost half the population of that island of Floriana was wiped out. They disappeared. Some of them were found as mummies years afterwards in other islands. And it was a big mystery that appeared in a number of publications in those years. So again, I took that true story and I played with it a little, and I created fiction out of that. And all of those stories that appear in Album de Familia, which is family album, that speak a little about the album, the family album of Ecuador, I would say, talk about the little known stories of Ecuador, but that in some sense are out there in our collective unconscious and at some point have to do with how we perceive ourselves as Ecuadorian.
And tell us about your last published book called La Muerte Silba el Blues. That's the latest work that you have done.
Yeah, I published that 4 months ago.
And it's been getting great reviews in the newspaper and abroad. Could you tell us about this book? And it's talking about Paraguay.
At some point, the first part, it's divided in 2 parts. The first part talks about what happened in 1949 here, the replication of what Orson Welles did in New York in 1938 with The War of the Worlds. But the second part of the book has to do with different topics around what I would call how modern society works, isolation, individualism, the impossibility of connecting with someone nearby, the need of selfies, of Facebook, the need to be out there all the time. So I play with that a little. I like to play in literature. I like to play with the forms of it. And what I did in this book is that I took the titles of all the short stories in this collection from a director from Spain called Jess Franco. And what Jess Franco did is, in the late 50s, 60s, and 70s, is that he has one of the biggest filmographies of all cinematic history. He did more than 200 films. And what he did, what made him different from anybody else, is that he always worked with very small budgets. and he would get his crew together, he would get his actors, and he would never tell any of these people what he was filming. He would only give the screenplays for the day. And he would shoot for a month, and then finally what he really did is that he was shooting 5 films at the same time, but he was only paying everybody for one. And he would get 5 films at the end of the day, and that's how he kept on producing. And I thought it was a wonderful way of creating with small budgets. I think it has a lot to do with what happens in Latin America, that with very small budgets, people manage to get along, manage to produce, manage to do things that are different, that are out there. So all of this last book has to do with Jess Franco. It has a strong connection with film. It has a strong connection with, like I was telling you, with mass media. It has a strong connection with what's going on in society at this point in time. So yeah, and it was published in Colombia, so it's been having a sort of good circulation in Latin America at least.
Can you work in 2 novels at once?
No, I'm concentrated with my bourbon and my cigar and one book.
One book. I got a question about writers. Do you like to read a book, or you like to read it on the internet?
Book. I mean, I don't have a problem with reading an ebook. I have a Kindle, but it's not the same thing.
It's not the same thing.
It's not the same thing. And it's not just because of preferences or anything. Lately, I've been reading about it because I can see that the same concentration doesn't go into the 2 mediums. And I found that there's been a number of articles published, scientific articles, that talk about the spatiality of a book, that you need to see the number, that you need to it has something to do with the way that our mind works, and the ebook still isn't the same thing.
Yes, a teacher now, you've been teaching for many years. Do you see the young students or the younger generation reading books, or they're so concerned about the media and
well, if you put the books out there, people still love to read. I mean, but you have to give the option. I think something that's happening lately is that people don't have the option anymore. It's assumed that you only have the telephones, the pads, the tablets, the laptops, but you give a kid a book, 14, 13, 12, 19, 20, and he devours it. And it's real. I'm not just saying it. It's people still read. I mean, there have never been so many books published in all of history. In all of history. And I don't think there's been more people writing, even if it's text, or reading, even if it's on tablets and the concentration is not there. But I think that at some point we have to harvest that. We have to see what to do with all of that, because reading isn't disappearing, but concentration is. It's dwindling away. So I think that people have to sit down and figure out what to do, because I don't know in 10 years what's going to happen.
Gabriela, who are you reading now?
Right now, I'm reading Gombrowicz, this wonderful Polish writer who lived in Buenos Aires in Argentina by some weird form of how the world works. He was given a free ticket just before the beginning of the Second World War to try out a transatlantic that was going from Poland to Argentina. And when he arrived in Argentina, the war broke out. And he lived in Argentina for 24 years. He learned Spanish finally, but he wrote all his works in Polish. And recently they've been all translated, but at some point when he was still living in Argentina, his greatest book, called Ferdiduk, was translated by a group of people who just admired him. Gombrowicz is considered like in the vanguard, in the same, occupying the same space as Joyce or Kafka. So I'm having fun reading that right now.
And for our younger audience in the States, Anglo-speaking audience that follow us in this program, where are the links that you can see your work?
Well, there's a number of them. If you go into Google and put my name, there's at least maybe like 14 different web magazines that have short stories. All of Album de Familia actually is on the web. If you take your time to just search for it, the whole book is online.
And who's your favorite basketball team?
My favorite basketball team, oh my God, the Knicks.
The
Even
Knicks.
though they always lose now.
Always lose.
But before they used to win.
Thank you, Gabriela, for your time.
Thank you, Andy.
I really appreciate it.
It's been great.
This has been Gabriela Aleman on Interviews from Quito. My name is Andy Sebastia. We'll see you next time.